Hello guys, so today we want to talk about the labor question here in Zimbabwe. So talking about the labor question by the period 1890 when Zimbabwe was colonized, we see that the whites, they could get labor in short supply, so they had to adapt, or they had to use different methods. So they only had two options to obtain labor here in Zimbabwe or in other countries. So the two options were that they had to force the blacks here in Zimbabwe to work, or they had to import labor from other countries like Nyasaland uh, and Northern Rhodesia. So today we want to talk about the acts that were put in place by the settlers in order to get labor from the Zimbabweans. So the first act that was put in place by the British Southern African Company, or by the whites who had colonized Zimbabwe, was the Labor Bureau Act of Southern Rhodesia. This was enacted in 1899, 9 years after the colonization of Zimbabwe. So the Labor Bureau Act, it meant that Africans were forced to work. Africans were forced to work, or Chibaro was being used. They were forced to work in the farms of the whites. Okay. However, even though they were forced to work, it is said that the Ndebele and the Shona, they remained poor recruitment grounds. So what exactly did this act states? Through Chibaro, there was extensive use of physical force by the whites, so they could use force, as I have said, in order to get labor. So they could use the brutal police boys in order to get labor. So the brutal police boys were the ones which were used in order to obtain that labor. Okay, moving on. Those who resisted were often flogged. If you resist, they were often flogged. The recruitment board took advantage of economic force, so they took advantage of the economic problems that were happening here in Zimbabwe, such as drought, okay, which took place in 1903, 1912, and 1918. So moving on, there was also another act which was imposed by the British, or by the whites, in order to recruit labor. So this includes the Master and Servant Ordinance. So the Master and Servant Ordinance, the employee or the whites had to sign agreements with the blacks, and then the whites could extend the calendar or the date of payment. So let's say, for example, the month is 30 days, but they could extend those 30 days to 42 if they could want. The blacks were forced to sign contracts, okay, so that they could not desert work. They were forced to sign contracts in front of the brutal police boys, okay, which were the police of the British Southern African Company. So this operated throughout the colonial period. So this contract, or this Master and Servant Ordinance, it persisted throughout the colonial period. The act stipulated that the number of working days per period, and it allowed employers to engage laborers for more than the calendar month. Like I have said, could the whites or the settlers, they recruited labor through signing of agreements, and they could extend the days on the calendar from even 30 to 42. At some mines, laborers were forced to accept 6 months contract in the presence of the compound brutal police boys. So like, this is all what I have said. So another act which was put in place was it was passed in 1902, 2 years after the colonization of Zimbabwe. These were the pass laws. So the pass laws, it is said that no one was allowed to move around without a pass. So what exactly? So the British Southern African Company introduced the pass laws meant specifically to control labor desertions. So people were deserting their place of work to move to other areas where they could be free, or where they could find better paying jobs. So they introduced the pass laws, so that if you were caught moving without this pass, when you were supposed to move around, you were supposed to have a pass. Okay, so it was meant to reduce random movement of black labor. So that was the main purpose of these pass laws. Okay, so we also have the 1911 African Labor Regulation Act. So this was another piece of legislation which specifically covers employees in agriculture and mining, and it blocked employees from switching employment for higher wages. So this African Labor Regulation Act, enacted in 1911, it restricted, okay, it restricted employees from switching employment for higher wages. Let's say I am an employee, I'm a worker, I'm a worker. I was not allowed to switch my job. Whether it doesn't matter I was getting low salary, I wasn't allowed to switch my place of work. Okay, so during this period, workers were moving to get other jobs, which were high paying during this colonial period. So the 1911 African Labor Regulation Act, it stated that you were not allowed to switch your job to get a higher paying salary, or you were not allowed to switch your job so that you could get more income. So lastly, we have the compound system. So the compound system is just says that compounds or houses were built in mines, farms. These accommodated the blacks. So the blacks were accommodated in compounds. So in compounds, they were just, let's take for an example, on the farm, just random houses were built. These were the compounds. Random houses were built where people could live in these random houses, and they, by living in these random houses, they had to supply cheap labor. However, I'm going to make another video talking about the problems which people faced in these compounds. So this is all on the labor question here in Zimbabwe, which were the measures put in place by the British Southern African Company, by the British, the settlers, or the whites, in order to recruit labor in Africa and in other countries. Cheers.